In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Peace and blessings be upon you all. We hope that all our brothers and sisters are doing well and in good health. Welcome to all brothers and sisters to episode number 7 of the Ask Hassan Ilyas series. This is your opportunity to ask live questions directly to Muhammad Hassan Ilyas, a student of Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. And in that regard, today we have Brother Hassan present with us on our panel. At the beginning, I would like to present a small question. A few weeks ago, President Trump gave a statement regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. He said that he would relocate the Palestinian Muslims living in Gaza and completely eradicate Hamas from there. Then, in the future, he would rebuild the Gaza Strip in their own interests. So, obviously, such an action received a lot of condemnation from around the world. When someone asked Ustaz Ghamidi about this and insisted on condemnation, he commented that whether or not I condemn this makes no difference. In the end, the decision lies with those who hold power and resources. Upon this statement by Ghamidi Sahib, the critic commented that, by condemning this statement, it will first prove that you are a good human being. Let that part of you come forth. And similarly, the world will see that you are a courageous person. He further said with sarcasm, since you are sitting in America, how could you dare to disagree with the state policies there? Then, continuing with the usual pattern of allegations, he said, you and Engineer Sahib were selected by Rand Corporation and launched for the purpose of extinguishing the little honor left among Muslims and to turn Muslims into transgender people. He further said, your approach, which stems from this inferiority complex that no matter how much America and Israel oppress us, we should not respond. This approach makes you unfaithful in some way. And you are actually our real enemies. On the day of judgment, you will be raised under the banner of these traitors and betrayers. This entire commentary was made by that gentleman. So in this regard, I would like to ask, there seems to be a deep frustration behind this entire critique. What is the psychology behind it? And why didn't you condemn this action by America? What was the complete background to this? I would like you to clarify your position on this.
Thank you very much, brother. Look, regarding the issue of Palestine, our respected teacher, Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, has expressed his point of view in great detail. If people want to understand it from beginning to end, then all those videos are available on our channel regarding its historical background and the religious arguments that are presented within this issue. All his opinions regarding its political solution have also come forth. People should read them, reflect on them, analyze them, critique them, understand that no person on the face of the earth is beyond criticism. As a human being, he has given his opinions. I am also just a minor student. I learn and understand from various people and religious perspectives. From them, I form some of my own views, and I also present them. So, over the past 2 years or so, in about 15 to 20 incidents, I have spoken on this subject. I have written some articles, and our detailed perspective has already come to light. People have the right to criticize it. But when criticizing, please keep 2 things in mind. First, as Muslims, when we disagree on strategic matters related to a crisis, it never means that we are supporting the ongoing oppression around the world. The global powers that have created inhumane tragedies in Gaza, in Palestine, and elsewhere in the world, say in Kashmir, and earlier in Chechnya, wherever oppression, tyranny, and despotism have reached such inhumane stages that they spill blood across the world, no one is supporting that. In matters of strategy or action plans or political stances of Muslims, when a new or different viewpoint is presented, it has become the common understanding among Muslims that to oppose our adopted strategy is to support the opposing party, but this is not the reality. Ghamidi Sahib, on every occasion, in every setting where discussion happened, and whenever this humble person had the opportunity to speak, we always began with this. In all this oppression is happening, we are also writhing in pain and we wish to stop it. To stop it, what is being demanded from us now and from the Muslim Ummah? What is that demand? People have said that since there is oppression now, children are dying, hospitals are being bombed, women have become left helpless, then this is not the time for such discussion or this analysis that this strategy wasn't correct or because of who and what we have reached this phase. But I ask, what time is it then? We can ask, what are you doing at this time? At this moment, Muslims around the world are making demands from the leadership of the Muslim Ummah, from intellectuals, scholars, political leaders, and state authorities. What are those demands? Is the demand this? Issue statements condemning the oppression happening there, or maybe send letters of support? No, their demand is that we must play some decisive role in winning this war. Just yesterday, scholars in Pakistan issued a press release. What did they say? They said, "Where is our military leadership, our army's capability? It should advance and help the oppressed." What does helping mean? Helping in this context means when you assist one side in a war, you become a part of the war. And once you become a part of it, then the consequences of war will also apply to you. So the demand is being made. Muslims should rise and take a side in this ongoing war. Whether it's an individual giving financial support, a ruler sending the air force, or the Muslim Ummah forming a joint action plan, everyone's demand is the same. Take a side in this war. No one is saying this war should stop. Just look. Pakistan's biggest scholar, Mufti Taqi Usmani Sahib, in the largest gathering in Islamabad on this topic, what did he demand? He said, "We oppose the ceasefire." Why? We should understand that too, because according to his narrative, oppression has been going on for 70 years. If oppression has lasted 70 years, then stopping the war now raises the question, why was war started after October 7th? Oppression was already happening, and when we say Hamas is responsible for the current bloodshed, people reply, Israel is ultimately responsible. This has been happening for 70 years. So if this has been happening for 70 years, then war was inevitable. That means the war shouldn't stop, because if it stops today, tomorrow oppression will return, and then the opposing side will say, war is again inevitable. Today it's Hamas. Tomorrow a new group could arise. So what does that mean? The Muslim community is saying war was necessary, inevitable, and needed. The level of oppression and tyranny had become such that no other path remained. So when there was no other path, what is being demanded of the Muslim community as a whole? This is the demand that I had responded to. My recent video, on which many people made harsh criticism and said that this was in fact supporting the oppressor by avoiding support for the oppressed, my response was regarding that very demand. Isn't this the demand that you lend your support in this war? So I have presented this submission there that from our point of view, if you offer support at this moment, if you join the war, if you become part of the war, then in reality, you are also directly confronting the opposing force. Go ahead and try it. For example, today if Pakistan does what other countries have done like Iran did or Lebanon did or Syria did, then what happened to those people is right before our eyes. No one can turn their gaze away from this matter. These are the obvious realities of the world. So our religious people at this time are presenting this demand to the Muslim Ummah. In response to this demand, I said, if fighting is the objective, then in this fight, you become a party, and there are consequences to that. Those consequences are visible to you today. When we point out those consequences, people say, you are supporting the oppressor. But this has nothing to do with supporting the oppressor. It would be support for the oppressor only if you heard from my mouth or from Ghamidi Sahib's mouth the statement that what is happening in Palestine is perfectly just, that the children being blown to pieces, that hospitals are being destroyed, that women are being subjected to cruelty and oppression, all of this is perfectly just. Have you ever heard such a thing from our mouths? Not once. On the contrary, what Ghamidi Sahib has said everywhere, and what I have said wherever I got the chance, is this. Look, this is indeed oppression. Even in my recent talk, I clearly said this. There is no talk of Israel's innocence in it. Nowhere is it being said that they have not committed injustice. At every point, on every occasion, we began our discussions with this point that what is happening, we are also deeply grieved by it. Who in this world would not be? Setting aside being a Muslim, even if someone is Jew or a Christian and possesses a sound natural conscience from God, if they are human, their heart will weep at this situation. Every person's heart weeps. But does that heartache mean that the course of action taken, the strategy adopted, should not be criticized? And then you say, this is not the time? Well then, tell me, what is the right time? Isn't it that very strategy which people are inviting you to repeat? A certain organization had acted on this strategy. The entire Muslim Ummah is being invited to implement the same strategy, to join the war. People are being told to provide financial support. Yesterday, I was listening to someone saying, bullets must not run out. People are collecting donations and providing aid. What is the aid for? It's aid for fighting a war. So if the goal is to fight a war, then let's speak the truth and admit that we're going to war. And if we're not going to war, then what it means is that you too are presenting a plan of action. For example, the person you mentioned said in his speech that we should not allow the use of our airspace. Has our conscience regarding the use of airspace become so weak that we're now just saying we shouldn't allow our airspace to be used? You say we should have a boycott. Brother, you should be going to fight. So if I say in response that, look, this means you are not serious about confronting Israel, this means you are not serious about ending these global powers, would I be right in saying this? People will say, you have lost your mind, so I am saying that this strategy of opposition that you have adopted is no longer feasible. If it had been feasible, some results of it would have appeared before us. What results have come before us? You know that in the known history of these Western countries, the biggest public protest demonstrations, what were they about? They were about the Iraq War. Look into British history after 2003 and look at the situation in America. Millions of people participated, they protested, they did everything, but did that bring an end to the war or stop those global powers from pursuing their interest there? When Ghamidi Sahab says that saying 2 words of condemnation won't solve the problem, what does he mean? When he says that this is a game of power and power becomes decisive, what does he mean by that? He means that we are all grieved, brother. We are all crying tears of blood. But crying tears of blood won't solve the problem. That's what he's saying. That is, nowhere does he say we are standing with the oppressor. He tries to explain that the strategy adopted has gradually led to the loss of whatever gains we had made. You say, no, war was the only unavoidable path. Well, if war was the only unavoidable path, then we should be mentally prepared for the consequences. And if you're demanding of us that everyone should be ready to bear those consequences, then ask yourself this question: can there not be any voice in the world that highlights that perhaps this is not the time for war, that you don't have the capability right now, you don't have the power, you need a period of peace? In this situation, whatever you had, even that has slipped from your hands. So would it not have been better to reconsider your plan and your strategy? Tell me, in this whole issue, where is the support for the oppressor being created? This is a plea to save the oppressed from dying, a desire to save them, a longing, a compassion. In your view, making 2 emotional speeches at this time won't win us any support? Our school of thought is already under constant attack due to our independent reasoning. Should we say a few lines, deliver a few emotional speeches, so that at this moment it somehow becomes a good deal for us, that everyone stands up and curses us and says they are traitors, and they went and sat in America's lap, and this happened, that happened? Which person wants to tarnish their own dignity like this? Who would want this? Which group, which faction would want this? Only that person, that faction, that group, which truly feels the pain of the Ummah in their heart, which truly feels the agony of their nation, and they are saying this, saying it while facing the opposition of everyone, saying that nothing has been gained from this. And I want to tell you that not many days or months will pass before this entire situation becomes a story of the past. When I first became conscious when America attacked Afghanistan, I saw thousands of youth leaving their seminaries in Pakistan, going to fight a global power. A few days later, we began to hear stories of divine help, angels, visions, dreams, and fragrance from graves. After some time, it was learned that there was now an urgent need for weapons, so people should donate. And people started donating. Some more time passed, and then it was learned that so many had been martyred. Then some more time passed, and we learned that some were imprisoned. Now donations should be made to free them. Then some more time passed, and people started reciting ritual prayers, reciting Surah Kahf, and curses began to be uttered in sermons. You have no idea what effect this demand being made from the Muslim Ummah has. The effect is that if we are not ready to fight, then our leadership, our rulers, our political leaders are labeled cowards. And then in our countries, those spirited youth who cannot reach Israel or America begin to clash with people here. Then in your own country, KFC gets set on fire. Then in your own country, scholars are assassinated. These are the same scholars who, in recent days, were supporting jihad in Afghanistan. But when the violence turned toward Pakistan and they opposed it, then their own fellow believers began slaughtering them. So you will see in this atmosphere being created today, similar issues will arise within our country. 1 or 2 generations will live with this sense of deprivation. and the consequences will be extremely dangerous. So if this is not the right time, when you are demanding from the entire ummah to join the war, to support the war, to be ready to fight, then do you think if you get ready to fight, if you support the war, will the opposing party consider you a benefactor or a friend? They will still consider you an enemy. And what they did there, you will also be provoking them to do to you. So whenever we speak on this issue, we do it in this context with this in mind. And this claim made by Muslims that they are sitting in America, they have ties with global imperialists and powers. I dare to ask my Muslim brothers, if you dislike a difference in strategy so much, if the frustration of your failed strategy depresses you so much that you can't even tolerate someone speaking differently, then ask yourselves, in the situation we've reached, what role did our own people play? Does Israel consult me before speaking? You say, curse Israel, curse America. Brother, will cursing America solve the problem? Curse them, curse until your throat is dry. Has that solved the Muslims' problem? You want to make us stand in that same row? You want us to curse too, insult too, speak hatefully too, so that your listeners also get swept up in emotion and hatred and are unable to analyze and study the issue calmly? Shouldn't there be some people within the Ummah who can show others the right direction, who can say this policy is not working? So what's this got to do with Ghamidi Sahib saying that 2 words of condemnation won't solve the issue? He condemns with tears of blood in his heart. Read his book Khayal-o-Khama from the time of the Iraq War. Read his poem. He has written it. He has shown that he feels the pain of those people. So the pain, he feels it more deeply in his heart. Isn't the pain felt more deeply in the hearts of those who, despite being abused by their own people, are still striving to guide them towards a better path? Or is this pain more intense in the hearts of those who are sitting in their own countries, keeping themselves safe and offering strategies in which there is no risk to their own lives? Yesterday in Pakistan, restaurants were burned down. Today, if the police were to announce, let all those brave warriors who did this come forward, not a single person would be willing to come out. No one would come forward to register their name saying, I did this. So if this spirit of faith, this passion is truly for the sake of religion, then one must understand the temperament of religion in light of the Sharia. We people, God Almighty has informed us, are bound by its rules. Jihad and combat come with conditions. One must assess one's own strength and analyze what changes come in the situation afterward. People are saying that if these people had been at Badr, if they had been at Uhud, they would have played the role of Abdullah bin Ubay. So I ask a question pushing forward. Angels descended at Badr, right? So why didn't they descend here? Where are the angels? Where is the help of God? I also expressed this point recently in a conversation, and I say it with God as my witness. I have met such people. I was raised in a religious household. I have written slogans in support of these jihadi organizations. If you ever get a chance, pick up Zarb-e-Momin. Dozens of articles were published in it with the same passion and zeal. We stood with full enthusiasm. We have seen those people. We have witnessed those situations. In Afghanistan, when in the deserts of Dasht Laili, thousands of people were locked in containers and drowned in their own sweat and excrement until they died, and the remaining prisoners, the way they were kept in prisons, they screamed, they cried out, where is God's help? Where is His support? So I say to those people who are reading out verses and emotionally manipulating others, let them answer this. At Badr, the angels visibly descended. Why were they not seen here? Why didn't we receive God's support here? The reason is that the principle that was established there has been misunderstood here. There, the Prophet of God stood. Even there were considerations of some balance of power. The Quran itself describes that balance. So what is the situation here? A small, besieged state, one that even receives its electricity from its opposing power. Its economy runs by sending workers into the homes of that same enemy power. If that small territory attacks by gaining support from neighboring states, then where are those states now? Tell me, did Iran attack Israel afterward? Where are those states that supported this? This must be understood with pain in the heart, that the direction in which the Muslim Ummah is being pushed will lead to the destruction of our future generations. And today, we are witnessing a generation already lost. 50,000 lives are gone. Those people were wiped out. The oppressor committed oppression, but we also facilitated the path for that oppression, did we not? So the question is, when we say facilitated, what do we mean? It doesn't mean the oppressor got a blank check. Facilitating means, did we adopt the approach that could have protected us from the oppressor's cruelty? For instance, when there were possibilities, This is the first war in 70 years that was fought collectively by 4 countries. If you get a chance, read the book written by the daughter of Maulana Maududi based on her father's memoirs. In it, she writes that during that time, those fighting in the air forces of these countries, about them, the ulema said that they saw in their dreams that they were meeting the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and they narrated stories about prophecies about victory. But what happened afterward? So the point is to understand and reflect. If the blood of the Ummah is being shed, then the greatest benefactors of this Ummah are those who, bearing the brunt of the Ummah's curses, are still trying to show people the reality. They are trying to explain who rules this world and how they operate. Just look now, what is this global order? A single announcement of tariffs by the president shook the entire world. People started pleading, our economies will collapse because of this. Why would they collapse? Weren't you free? Weren't you sovereign? Is this sovereignty and freedom even found in the real world? That's the question. Were there any protest movements in India greater than the Khilafat movement? Hindus and Muslims participated in it. Did we manage to save the Ottoman Empire as a result? Is this how matters are handled? So Ghamidi Sahib, with this pain in his heart, has tried to convey that power is blind, it is brute, it has no heart in its chest, no modesty in its eyes. To deal with it, we must know where we stand. So if the Muslim Ummah believes that it can attain victory through this path, then by all means, let it be victorious. If these protests, boycotts, arson, blockades, condemnations, and resolutions bring peace to their hearts, then our prayers are with them. But if such actions do not bring any change, then that's the tragedy. The tragedy is that no change is forthcoming. Not in Kashmir. What little was achieved has also been lost. We are saying there has been no change here either. Look back, over 70 years, have we ever adopted any strategy to stop the oppressor's tyranny? When opportunities arose, for example, the two-state solution, people said even they did accept it. But were we ready to accept it? The question is, he is not accepting it. In his country, he also has mischief makers sitting. Have we ever taken the initiative and said, the decision made by the United Nations, let's implement that at least? Did our religious leadership ever take a stand on it? Did they ever teach the whole world to acknowledge that we have been subdued, that global powers have forcibly planted a nation into this region, that it was done by force? Well, we don't have the power now. Times change. Global imperialism is not something made by God. It is not divine. America and Israel sitting in the world, they too will change. But in the meantime, as a practical matter, have we ever tried to think in light of our current conditions? Tomorrow, another global power may arise. It may take back the land for us. Hasn't this land been lost to us before? So when we speak to address this. What is the problem with Muslims? The tragedy of Muslims is that they have not been trained to tolerate disagreement in matters of religion, to entertain critical thought, or to accept new ideas. Nor have they been trained to tolerate disagreement in matters of society, politics, or strategy. We see everything in black and white. And in that black and white lens, anyone who stands with us is our ally. Otherwise, they are on the side of the oppressor. So I just want to say this is a matter of time. Time will pass. We know that what we are saying now sounds like a strange, unfamiliar voice. But time will pass. And the voices that people once raised in the past, after centuries, people recognize them as benefactors and well-wishers of the nation. Right here in India, after the War of Independence of 1857, whatever little we had achieved, we ended up living as slaves for 100 years after that. So if one yearns to become a slave and prepares oneself to be enslaved, then Ghamidi Sahib has tried to draw attention to this. Look, you've tried fighting. What did you gain? If fighting hasn't achieved results, then adopt another approach. And in this way, the great thinkers and benefactors of the Ummah, even while enduring abuse, still try to guide the Ummah to the right path. You are free to oppose this path. That is your right. But to doubt someone's intentions, their motives, their honor, this is unacceptable. For our religious scholars, if you disagree with them, they say, well, there must be a problem with his creed. His prayers are invalid. If you differ in politics, then he is a traitor to the nation. He's sitting in America's lap. He does such and such things. Well, here we are sitting in this very America. This is my camera before you. On my right hand, there is a picture of Maulana Syed Abul Ala Maududi. We are sitting in America and talking about him. Who was he? He presented a political interpretation of religion. He called for the dominance of Islam. We may differ with his ideas, but still we carry his picture on our chests with respect and honor. The greatest tragedy of the Ummah is that it cuts off its own people, distances those who might show a way forward, and brings to leadership those who stir emotions, chant slogans, and stage protests, and then they sit in their comfortable cars and go home and sleep. And after that, there is oppression all over the world, children die, and you come here and sigh. Then this is a moment for reflection for all of us. It is a moment for deep thought. People say that this crisis has a 70-year history and tale of oppression. Did anyone disagree with you? I mean, have you ever heard from us that what has happened? We go even further and say, brother, that Israel, the borders that have been drawn across the world between countries, are they based on justice and fairness? Was the partition of Pakistan based on justice? Was the partition of Burma based on justice? Was the division of Kurdistan based on justice? Was the division of Afghanistan based on justice? Global imperialism after wars drew the lines between countries as victors. Which of these were in line with the demands of justice? This is exactly what Ghamidi Sahib is trying to explain when he says that power is blind. So does this mean support for the blindness of power? Is it being said that now there are no ethics? People wrote that Ghamidi Sahib said power is blind, so this means he doesn't believe in any ethics. What he is actually trying to say is this: when someone becomes blind and starts swinging a stick around, you try to protect yourself, you ensure your own safety. These ethics are mine. How can my ethics be theirs? Yesterday, I saw a prominent religious scholar standing at a place preaching, and he said, okay, Hamas killed 1,200 people, and Islam says that as much as you are oppressed, you can retaliate in kind. So if they killed 1,200 people, we should also kill 1,200 people. So I am the one following Islam, right? I'm implementing Islam. Who is going to teach him how to act on Islam? So at such a time, what should be said? You have to say that in a neighborhood, a thug has been seated there by a powerful one, and he harasses you every day. So there are only two possibilities. Either you throw a stone at him, and after that, he will burn the whole neighborhood. Who will suffer the loss? Or through compromise, mutual understanding, dialogue, some give and take, you try to maintain your presence, your survival there. You struggle through political means. In recent days, I wrote some articles, read the books of those who have been reflecting on this issue for centuries, who have spent years on this conflict and written books about it. They include Edward Said and others like him. They did analysis and provided insights. There's Noam Chomsky, he gives analysis. There's Harari, he says that even in this situation, possibilities exist. If you frame everything through religion, it becomes a war of truth and falsehood. The opposing party won't be willing to listen. These possibilities have also been presented. But if, as a result, you keep saying the same thing over and over again, that because there was oppression, we went to war, and now we must support war, then what should we say at this point? We can only say that, brother, at this time, those poor people over there, 50, 60,000 have died, and here you are dreaming of taking 2, 4, 8, 10 million others into war. You need to wake up from this dream. The need of the hour for the survival of the Ummah, its reconstruction, its stability, is that we must be strong in our own countries. The peaceful window of opportunity we've been given in the face of global powers, in that window, we should stand at a place where we can be in a position to talk. We are giving this call of truth, and we know this is not an easy task. After that, reputations are auctioned in public markets. The history of the Muslim Ummah is that whenever such things are said, they are flogged on their backs, their homes are attacked, their intentions and reputations are questioned, fatwas and accusations are rained down on them, they are called traitors to the Ummah, and propaganda is done to discredit them globally. I am ready for all of this. I am just a small student. I am not someone who has assumed the leadership of the Ummah in such crises. Our teacher said something, and I found that statement correct. I want to convey that message to the Ummah in my own way. Perhaps a few people may be willing at this moment to think that we are not supporting oppression, we are describing a strategy to protect ourselves from the oppressor.
Yes, thank you very much, Brother Hassan. You explained in great detail that mere condemnation cannot solve such issues. At the very least, there should be some people within the Ummah who with a realistic approach and without falling into emotions, can give the Ummah a vision. Brother Hassan, another thing is usually heard from the other side, and many brothers are also commenting on this, that we have also seen it now. We have fought many wars with Israel, and we haven't seen much better outcomes. So let's say we're not even suggesting a strategy to declare war. But at the very least, scholars like you should come forward and tell the public that if we, as a group of around 2 billion Muslims, if we all together boycott Israeli products, cut our diplomatic relations with them, terminate our trade relations, and even block our sea routes, then at least we would be in a position to bring Israel to its knees. So, do you not think, despite such a large number of Muslims, and those gentlemen even said we have an army of 80 million, we are a nuclear power state, that even then, these suggested strategies like boycott are not feasible?
If this is actually a viable option and this is what should be done, then first of all, oppose the war. Then say the sentence I had said earlier, which people disliked, and it hurt many people's feelings that the strategy Hamas adopted for war is fatal. So first go ahead and say that sentence. Okay, we're not in that position right now, but here are the steps we will take, the steps you just mentioned. Boycott economically, take political steps, do such things, all these things. So first oppose the war. If war is to be waged, then encourage people for war and say, we are an army of 80 million. Among the 57 Muslim countries, there are 4 countries with proper air forces. Among those, the planes you use, they are owned by Turkey, then Pakistan, then Indonesia. These are the few countries that have such large armies. Where do the planes they use come from? Where do the weapons come from? Where do they get the technology? You are aware that Pakistan waited 20 years, even after paying for the delivery of F-16 jets. Right now, Turkey's biggest wish is to obtain the most advanced jets from the US. So when people talk about war, that we have an 80 million army, we're ready for war, then at least with a calm mind, with reason, wisdom, insight, and prudence, one should reflect on whether the party you're going to war with is alone, a small country of a few thousand kilometers, or if there are global powers standing behind it. Today, the bombs Israel is dropping, what bombs are these? Where are they coming from? They are coming from the country that currently that is the de facto ruler of the world. So war wouldn't just mean war with one country. Understand this. War means you're taking on global powers. So if you want to make a comparison, don't compare yourself, your 80 million army, and 57 Muslim countries with Israel. Compare the 57 Muslim countries with the global powers. Then you'll realize where you stand in terms of power in a war. The countries that are present there, those surrounding countries, ask the military experts there as well. What happens is you need a base, and you're talking about attacking from Pakistan, you'll have to fly out. The neighboring countries all jointly decided to go to war, and they did. But was it effective? So if the point is to talk about economic boycotts and political measures, then accept this. We're not in a position to wage war. War would be devastating for us. Whatever you now possess as a result of war will be completely lost. Then, at least speak the truth. And if you believe this, then sit with your own people, sit with the high-ranking officials of the Pakistan military and ask them, can your aircraft even reach Israel and drop a bomb? Ask them. Can these aircraft even fly in that direction? Go and ask. You'll find out the truth. The aircraft we currently possess can't even face towards India. That's the reality. In such a reality, talk of war doesn't hold. Everyone accepts this, but stating the truth is difficult because when you do, dreams remain unfulfilled, hopes and desires are shattered, and as a result, the public you have emotionally charged and motivated will turn against you. I know these Muslim leaders, we sit with them, we have conversations, I know the constraints they face. When they get up on the stage, even those who don't believe from the heart, they are compelled to say those things because we've hyped up our public so much. That's the first point. The second thing you said was, let's act economically, block their pathways that way. My question is, why hasn't this been done until today? Why hasn't it been possible? Is it just because of a few rulers? Because of the influence of the West? Why hasn't it happened? Because it's practically impossible. Take our country. If you hate America because it supports Israel, go out and protest and say, because America trades with Israel and benefits it, we are halting our trade with the US from today. Make that announcement. Why don't you make it? Because it's not feasible. People will starve. Your textile industries currently export goods worth $6 billion. The moment tariff talks start, we start screaming. We cannot afford it. That means you'll have to shut down factories employing 1 million people in your country. Stop exporting to America from tomorrow. Boycott it. Then there is a price that they have to bear. Is the Muslim Ummah ready to pay that price? You say there's no political solution, no realism, just idealism and demands for justice? Fine, let the whole ummah pay the price, then go and prepare them. Your demand is we should prepare them. But if you haven't been able to, and we, with our weak voice, nobody listens to us, how will we prepare the ummah? You've been shouting these slogans for 60 years. The religious leadership has been pushing this narrative. Why hasn't it worked? Why haven't you reached the point where you could defeat this country politically, geographically, economically, diplomatically? It's simply not possible in reality. Doesn't Turkey have relations with Israel? Doesn't Egypt? Jordan, right next door, has relations too. Why don't they attack? Because they know the reality? Boycott? Fine. But what impact would it have on their economies? Look at our own economy. Look at the scale. In global wealth distribution, they say Arab countries have a lot of money. The day Arab countries decide to actually act against that internationally backed country, just see how their wealth, like sand slipping from a hand, will start to vanish. Where is that wealth stored? In those same Western countries. They went and drilled oil there at the West's behest. Monarchies were established under their wishes, and you think by making an emotional speech and having 2 billion Muslims march on the streets, something will change? Look at the Delhi massacre of 1857. The entire Indian subcontinent didn't rise up. The British had only 5,000 to 8,000 troops. You believe there were millions of Muslims in Delhi at that time? Did they come out? No, because the necessary tools and strategies weren't in place. If you had something in hand, you'd come out. If you could stand on your feet, you'd rise up. For countries like ours, this kind of hope sold to the people, there's no real possibility behind it. We couldn't even come out and fight with India, just think. In this conversation, I said with hesitation, have we won Kashmir? We are 270 million strong, a nuclear power. We have everything. Kashmir is right next door. Have we taken it? And you're talking about dealing with Israel? Did the boycott of India make a difference? We fought, we boycotted, we tried everything. Did it make any difference globally? Because the world runs on reality. What governs is power. Power comes from economic advancement. If your voice is actionable in those countries, spread it. Who's stopping you? You want us to raise this voice too. We don't consider it valid because it's not workable. You've tried spreading it for 70 years. It hasn't become viable. And now, if Ghamidi Sahib says it twice, the whole Ummah will boycott Israel and wave flags of victory? Which world do you live in? Which utopia? Come out of that utopia for a moment. Empty your mind and listen to these thinkers. Try to understand what they're saying. They're explaining what a workable solution looks like, how to live with dignity. You say, we don't want to live like jackals, we want to live like lions. Fine, but living like a lion has consequences. When those consequences appear, then people start lamenting. So then, why do you cry? Which world are we living in? If you truly think you should go fight, then every person who wants to, the path is open. Go there and offer your services. If your narrative is that you don't want to live like a jackal, then take the bullet in your chest and present yourself to God, if that's your viewpoint. But if your viewpoint is the one you're expressing now, then make it actionable. Have we stopped you? Did the Ummah abandon boycotts because we told them to? Ghamidi Sahib himself said, even if protests happen 10 times, it's the people's right. They get emotional. Do we ever sit down and think, despite being 2 billion, why we're ineffective? Because these 2 billion are dependent, defeated vassals of global powers. Their economies and budgets don't function without them. They're one signal and governments are toppled. And how did they reach this position? Through power. We used to have that position. We used to make such decisions. Did we go to Africa, Hungary, Budapest, or Spain with petitions? No, we had power, and power is decisive. That's what Ghamidi Sahib is explaining. So you want to take action, want to burn restaurants in your own countries, destroy your own economies, and think it will make a difference? Have you studied, reflected, been given the opportunity to analyze? Even if we destroy the economy of that countryside, even then the global powers won't be shaken? Do you think it will come to an end? America has $150 trillion in wealth. $150 trillion, and we are begging the world for just $1 billion, which isn't even 0.1% of that. We are holding out our begging bowls in front of the world. Why? Why don't we go to the rulers sitting in our own backyard? Why are we begging? Because if we don't beg and get handouts, then we can't make a budget. If there's no budget, then the fan won't run, electricity won't be produced, vehicles won't move, letters of credit won't open, and oil won't come in. These are compulsions of the real world. On the other hand, there's emotionalism. If the government increases the price of anything, people scream that the rulers are corrupt. They say, once the Islamic system is established, everything will be fine. Well, go look at the neighboring state where the Islamic system has been established, see the state of their economy. Even to run that system, they're negotiating with global powers about the money those powers have. They're saying, give us our money, which you have. So this is the real world, while you people keep showing us dreams. And after showing us those dreams, you upload your videos on YouTube, that YouTube which they built, that Facebook which they built, and then you sleep peacefully. Meanwhile, our children are dying in front of bombs because people got emotional. So tell me, who is really the well-wisher of the Muslim Ummah? Who wants to save this nation with blood, with honor? And who is, through these emotional deceptions and dreams, trying to rob us of even what little we already have? Who is the true benefactor of this Ummah? These are the questions we raise with a heavy heart. We know we'll be abused for saying this. We know what it's like to be garlanded with flowers and what it's like to be cursed. You just have to give 4 speeches, just 4 speeches sitting in the same spot. People say they fear America, but Ghamidi Sahib lived in Pakistan. He was a lone, feeble voice when the invasion of Afghanistan was happening. At that time, they were sitting in America, in Israel's lap. The threats to their lives came from those who claimed to act in the name of Islam. Their students were martyred in this country by those who claimed to act in the name of Islam. But even then, Ghamidi Sahab did not hold back from speaking the truth. If he comes here now and says, my opinion has changed, and you accuse him of being pro-America or doing it for his citizenship, I swear to God, as far as I'm concerned, and as much as I know my teacher, not for a moment do we feel that we are not allowed to say what we believe to be the truth on this land. And if restrictions are placed on us for speaking the truth, then may God's curse be on such citizenship, on such a residence. And we also know that after doing all this, when they return to their countries, their own people will scratch out our flesh and dispatch us off from this world. We know these things. These statements are made to distract, to show people dreams which, when they are interpreted, result in frustration and depression. And in depression, Israel is not visible, so go ahead and curse those who had advised us against fighting. And as a result, there was defeat, so it appears that we are defeated because of them. So please have a bit of sense, have a bit of wisdom. These people, the great thinkers who are born occasionally, brother, you will see later, after 2 or 4 centuries, people will build their statues in public squares and say that these were the benefactors who had advised us at a time when the whole ummah was caught in it, to understand the practices of the world, to understand international affairs, to understand national status, to understand centers of power. Be grateful for what you have been given. If you are grateful, I will surely increase you.
Yes, mashallah, Brother Hassan. You spoke in great detail and in a very reasoned manner. And I believe the point you made that even the resources of Muslim countries are tied to those powers, that we purchase weapons from them, and even for their maintenance, we have to ask for donations from those same powers. I think our political leadership has realized this. That is why they are not taking such steps for now. But very soon it could happen, and it should happen, that our religious leadership also realizes this so that better strategies can be proposed. Jazakallahu khairan, Hassan Bhai. It was a pleasure talking to you. Let's now take the callers one by one. Danish Ibrahim Bhai, please confirm from your side whether your question is also related to the same topic.
Peace be upon you.
Peace be upon you too.
You have presented the entire political scenario before us, historically as well, which you have also laid it out in front of us. All of this is absolutely correct. The facts have come to light, and they are completely grounded in reality. No one can even disagree with them. But the question is, now what should be done? Thousands of people are becoming martyrs there. Now what should be done? From your side, from Ghamidi Sahib's side, whatever solution is presented, it is a long-term solution spanning centuries. That we improve ourselves in knowledge and ethics. That we reach such an economic level that we can bargain from a position of strength. This is something that could take at the very least several decades. So that thing is absolutely right. That must be done. But for the time being, what should we do now? We can't even impose any sort of economic pressure. My question was related to this. If we are not in a position to wage war, at the very least, our oil-rich Gulf countries could exert some economic pressure. But you too have shown that we are not in a position to do even that. So, for now, what should be done? When from intellectuals like you, from the scholars, the expression becomes one of anger, and the kind of reciprocation you people are also facing is in front of you. If you could shed some light on this.
Look, whenever an unfortunate event happens, like a fire breaks out in a house, then at the time the fire is burning, if you ask the residents, okay, fine, it's your fault the fire broke out. Now put it out and do something to eliminate it. This is not in their hands. When such a situation arises, and it arises in the life of nations, it doesn't end just by saying a few things, giving a few suggestions, making a few speeches. This is exactly what Ghamidi Sahib is trying to explain, that a few words of condemnation are uttered against an injustice, just like condolences are expressed when someone dies. But this is an issue pertaining to nations and an issue involving global powers. When they enter into such conflicts to protect their interests, then our speeches and wishes are no longer actionable, meaning our expectations don't result in anything. If we want to do something, as you said, how to begin the journey of change, the first step must be taken. It may not bring immediate change in the world, but you will start seeing the results not in centuries, but within decades, within years. There is one task, the only task, the first task, and that task is that the Muslim Ummah's religious leadership must initiate the journey of returning reality, and they must tell people, where do you stand in the world? You have been defeated. You have no political standing. You are economically weak. War is not your path. Stopping this war is something the religious leadership must proclaim. If this begins today, then in 5 or 10 years, you will begin to see change. Right now, the generation on whom you have poured the bloodlust, you'll have to pull them back from there. And that is not an easy task, brother. To do this, the narrative you have built of fighting without power, without capacity, without ability, without weapons, based on religious texts, will have to be revisited. If you keep shouting for 70 years that in Badr there were only 313 men, then had Ghamidi Sahib been there at the time, he would have been trying to stop the battle. If you say that at such and such time, Abdullah bin Ubay said, you go fight. If you keep repeating that, then to reverse it, you'll have to endure abuse, just like we are enduring abuse today. Whoever begins to bear this abuse, that day the journey of change will begin. We will try to tell the Muslim nations that we are not in a position to fight. So expedience and realism, I recently said in a podcast. They asked, this land, for example, used to be ours, the Muslims' land. After World War I, outsiders were settled here. I said, brother, if this is our case and we want to suggest a solution based on it, then it will take us to the same place where we are sitting today. Hindus say India was their ancestral land. You ruled there. Africans say it was theirs. So, as a result, wherever we are sitting today, in the countries we are settled in, from whom we are asking for power to wage war, those cannot remain established. If these justice-based claims are taken forward, then we are fighting the Taliban over them and telling them, brother, be realistic. A line has been drawn, separation, fine, your civilization is yours, fine, your society is yours, your language is yours. A line has been drawn, now accept it, live peacefully, do what you want in your own country. In our country, no, but they do not accept this. So a realistic analysis and explanation, that is the first step. If we do not take this step today, we will have to take it in a few years or a decade or 100 years. If this step is not taken today, there is no other way. The moment we abandon armed struggle, accept reality. I've written a detailed article on this, on the Palestine issue. People can read it. I've explained how the religious leadership has made 3 decisions. And the consequences of those 3 decisions are what we are suffering all over the world. They will have to be reversed. And reversal is not an easy task. To reverse them, the entire thought process must be analyzed and deconstructed. That too must be reconstructed. We will have to understand that when the Quran speaks of help and victory, how it was specific to the Prophet, how it happened in the context of a balance of power. So how is it a divine law? This is a very difficult task, brother. Here you can't even agree on raising hands in prayer. There you're talking about reconstructing the whole religious philosophy. Ghamidi Sahib has begun this immense task that he is trying to dig out the roots and show them to the Muslim Ummah. He's not just talking on the surface. He is saying, understand why God's help didn't arrive in this case. People are taunting us about, so he is trying to explain why it hasn't come. Just think, People don't realize it at the moment. Among those hundreds of thousands, how many Muslims would there be whose faith had reached a certain point? When they saw this situation and said, these people talk about God, they recite God's book and say divine help will come. So where is God's help? Where is divine victory? Then verses are recited. Even the hypocrites at the time said, when will God's help come? But did God's help come or not? Then, He will surely establish them in the land. Did that happen or not? Then, He gave them authority in the land. Did that happen or not? And those people, those Bedouins of Arabia, did they not receive the governments of the world? Then why hasn't it happened here, brother? So he is trying to explain this. If you don't pass your thinking through stages of refinement, there will be no change. Today, if the Muslim Ummah, its religious leadership, decides that the political leadership, the roadmap they are presenting, the strategy, we will follow that. Then look, if a practical proposal is made, the ground is ready, people are willing to listen. Those same people who are snatching chicken pieces from people's plates in Bahadurabad and Charminar in Karachi, saying they are made by Israel, will you give them a practical solution? But when you charge the public up like this, then they are no longer in a state to listen or understand. They say, curse them or you're a traitor. This has always been the demand in every era. But there is only one roadmap for change in today's time. The scholars of the Muslim Ummah should make their people aware of the reality. The day they introduce them to the truth, we will leave the world of idealism and move toward practical solutions. And the political leadership is adopting those solutions. You ask us why people don't rise, but even within this very nation, there's a West Bank. Those people haven't risen. Even within Israel, 20 to 25% of the population is Muslim of the same lineage, they haven't left. Next to them is Jordan, 60 to 70% of the population are Palestinian citizens, they haven't risen. Why? Because political forces gave them practical truths and people were willing to accept them. So these people also remember this. Right now we are being abused and insulted, remember this. It's just a matter of a few months. And we who have been saying this while being cursed for 2 years, it's only a matter of a few months before everything this Ummah had will slip from its hands. Then they will come and rage at us. You didn't curse Israel, it's your fault this happened. This is the kind of frustration that emerges in the minds of defeated nations.
Another thing is often said. Fine, don't go down the path of war. Focus on political solutions instead. But if you look at the ground reality, even the ground is no longer ready for any kind of political solution. Just like how the borders changed in 1948, and then in 1961, the opportunities, Muslims have lost all those opportunities. If we look at the situation today, in 2025, there is nothing left, really. Even if we move toward a political solution, still there remains no place of dignity for the Palestinians.
It is not for us to proceed in any such situation. It is the Palestinians who have to decide whether to proceed. What difference does it make whether you proceed or not? They are the ones who must decide. And a portion of them have already made their decision. They are still not participating in this resistance movement. So the question is not whether we decide. Will the matter then go in our favor if we do? That's just your wishful thinking. Today you might adopt a political narrative, but the others, they have invaded and pursued their hidden agendas. We gave them the opportunity and they fulfilled their aims. This dream that people have, it's just like saying, until yesterday, for example, I wasn't studying or reading, but if I open a book today, I'll get a job tomorrow. Getting a job requires stages, challenges, a whole world of competition. Thousands of people are waiting. So this dream we see that after doing this, we will attain that. The question is what we had has already passed the limit. Now, what little remains at this moment, there's no leadership. At this moment, there's no guidance. Those religious figures who could have offered direction to the nation, what are they saying? Fight till the last drop of blood, offer the sacrifice of your life, glorify the martyrdom of the oppressed. And those sitting there, is this what the religious leadership of the Ummah is telling them? That God has chosen you to be present in His court. So, my brother, if you have no control over political matters, then you have struggled to bring them under control. That effort must begin today. For that, the religious leadership must change its tone, its language, and speak with one voice. For now, just wait a few days, you'll forget the entire world because of what is about to happen to you in your own country. Just be patient in your own neighborhood. A government has been formed on the basis of showing this very dream. This is the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, which went to the United Nations against the Islamic Caliphate and Emirate in Afghanistan. There's a short pause right now. You have no idea what's boiling inside Pakistan, the lava that's rising. From your neighborhood, we trained thousands and hundreds of thousands of people here and sent them there, who then achieved victory. But in that victory, thousands of their children were martyred. Do you think after that they'll just sit still? A little time will pass, then people will understand. Forget Palestine. Even saving our own country will become difficult. Why? Because of what we've done in our neighborhood. Political changes do not come in a moment, nor from wishes and desires. They arise from ground realities, and that takes time. If for 70 years you've followed one direction and everything slipped from your hands, now you say, if we change this now, everything will return immediately. From where will it return, brother? How will it return? Will it return because you want it to? No. It will come through their favor. And their favor depends right now on this situation, that we engage in war with them, that we declare ourselves as a power standing against them. Their products, brother, are our necessities. Whatever we make in our country, we use those to run it. Their products are essential for us. In Pakistan, when you get vaccinated during COVID, why didn't you boycott it? It came from America. Why didn't you boycott it? Because it was a need. The medicines made in your country, where do the formulas come from? There are needs, so should we boycott them? Okay, we should boycott Coke and Pepsi. Why, brother? Why not boycott YouTube and Facebook? Why not boycott these essential services? Because they are our needs. Subhanallah, you think by doing that, they'll weaken economically and our needs will still be met? Is that a plan of action? Is this, you're teaching the Ummah that in your own country, go insult the poor vendor, the one selling Israeli chicken for 10,000 rupees a month? Is that a strategy? Will that lead to victory over the world? Will that bring success against global powers? Just consider this. Just imagine, based on this very thing, that the strategies devised at the level of the Muslim Ummah and people are thrown into the fire because of them. Let me share something personal with you. In the Deobandi background I came from, in Pakistan, jihadi movements were rooted in Banuri town. It was their womb. The scholars from there prepared people all over the world. All the extremism, religiosity, these movements rose from the narrative they presented. We had sat there, we went through those phases. If you get a chance, read my columns. I wrote in support of those narratives. We were people inside that system. We used to glorify those things. We used to celebrate when buildings fell. We did all that. And where have we reached today as a result? If today we're reduced to breaking the windows of a KFC, and that is the state of Muslims, if the situation has come to this, then there's nothing more to be done. We have defeated ourselves, brought ourselves to this condition. Thank you very much.
We'll now move on. Our next caller is Mansoor Ahmed Bhai. He may unmute his mic and ask his question.
Assalamu alaikum. Brother Hassan, my question is, a decision was made by the conquerors, and to what extent that decision was implemented is one matter. But on the other side, a decision was also made by the Palestinian people that they would resist the conqueror's decision. Now, the morality of the conqueror's decision is a separate debate. But the Palestinians' decision, which still stands today, and because of which they are losing so many lives, what would you say about it? Was their decision correct? And could you also briefly touch on the morality of the conqueror's decision?
The conqueror's decision is never based on morality. Wars are fought, wars are won. What the conquerors have done around the world, we've said it again and again till our throats went dry. You call that justice and morality? I mean, the British Empire rose and took over half the world. Did that happen on any moral principles? Did it follow any ethical code? Not a single person, even in their own nation, is ready to admit that it was done on any moral grounds. Who claims it? No one ever has. So the morality of global powers, it's based on their interests. In the Middle East, their interests became aligned with a single country. They gave that country existence and made it so powerful that its removal is now nearly impossible. And the Islamic world there is accepting it, they're acknowledging it. You should Google this sometime. There was once a call for boycott and protest against Israel's industry and economy. These days, you can get all this info at your fingertips. What is it dependent on? This industry here, just take the boycott as an example. Go look deeply into it. Just yesterday, I saw someone shared, and he's a well-known scholar, a learned man. He shared this idea that since Muslims can't do anything else, at least go to the App Store and give Facebook a 0-star rating. Apparently, that will somehow cause them a loss of billions or trillions of dollars. Just imagine, how do economies run in those countries? What has the diamond industry done there? What impact has the startup economy had? Just Google it, look at the countries around us, even just take a look at Turkey. See the nature of Israel's trade relations with them. Look it up. All these countries around us, they're sitting here on this earth. Why doesn't the political leadership attack these things? Turkey has the first or second largest army in the Muslim world. In their own country, if there's a coup against them, their people are ready to be crushed under tanks. So why don't they go there to fight? Why don't we ask ourselves this question with honesty? We just say they're cowards, but they're not cowards, brother. They know the reality. Do you think that if they go there, Istanbul will remain safe? Do you think that if they go there, Ankara will remain safe? Do you think the planes that would take off from there, that those planes could even turn in that direction? Just yesterday or the day before, Trump said in a statement, what does Turkey want from the US right now? It wants F-35 fighter jets. This is how countries operate in the world. These are the realities of the world. Forgetting these realities, we have reached this point. You mentioned Palestine. Even within Palestine, there are different groups. There are ideological people and there are political powers. Those political powers are against this confrontation. They didn't have the government here. Where they do have the government, they are sitting there. They're not ready to fight or resist. One group adopted this particular viewpoint, and even that group came to power through an election in 2004. These matters were already unfolding when the decision for war was taken. So do you think the 2 million people living in the Gaza Strip had a say in it? Was there a referendum by them? It was an ideological group. It had a manifesto. It had a particular consciousness. There was weaponry which came from neighboring regions. Such weaponry cannot be made there. There's no situation there that allows entry. Proxy groups from here and there supported it and made it ready to war, and they made it ready at a moment when the political leadership in Israel was moving toward acceptance by bringing real ground realities into consideration. They were engaged in forming relations with Saudi Arabia. So they waged one final battle, thinking that if everyone accepted this, then in the real world, we would be completely alone. So they thought, let's fight this final war. Let's see what happens. Did they ask the population before going to war? The million or so children? That is, whatever effective power there was, you picked it up and brought hostages from there, and you've hidden those hostages because our prisoners are still there. May they return alive. They're alive there in torment, in humiliation. You hid this, and after that, thousands here died for their release. So those who were alive, we had them killed. This is something to think about, something to understand. You asked about strategy and planning. Strategy and planning have failed. Now, if I say it has failed, someone will say, oh, this is support for Israel. Brother, I'm crying for myself, crying for my nation that it failed. This failure is forcing us to lift the corpses of our children. So this is something to understand, that over there were many voices. There were major intellectuals there. Read their books. They have explained that for this cause, we were supposed to act politically, but we didn't. In the world, there is only one superpower. There are other powers too, which have passed through the influence of these global powers. Some gained their support. Has China ever been ready to stand up on the matter of Palestine? Did we ever do anything like that? So brother, when you adopt a political strategy, then it has consequences. If I choose to poke at a wrestler and expect him to only poke me back because that is what justice demands, brother, he is a wrestler. He'll throw a punch. He'll kick too. My nose will break. I'll suffer the loss. So this strategy that they adopted, discussion on this strategy is still necessary. Its results are in front of you.
Thank you for joining us. Our next caller is with us, Syed Saad Tirmizi. Brother, you can unmute your mic and ask your question.
Peace be upon you.
Peace be upon you too.
I wanted to ask. You've given the whole political view, and I understood it. But there are 2 or 3 religious points that, when I speak with someone, they raise these. First, in Surah Tawbah, 3 groups are mentioned. One group is ready for jihad, the second group does not have the ability but agrees, and the third group criticizes and raises questions about those who speak of jihad. So that group is mentioned in Surah Tawbah. Second, there's a hadith, perhaps from the Battle of Khaybar, where the Prophet, peace be upon him, cut down the Jews' date trees and economically boycotted them, because of which the Jews lost the war. Third, I believe someone mentioned it in a comment under one of your Facebook posts. They referred to a hadith in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that before the day of judgment there will come a time when bloodshed will be widespread, but people will not do jihad. So the companions asked why that would be, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, replied that people will love the world more than death. Is such a hadith authentic? And if so, how do you see it? These are just 3 points. If you can discuss them, that would be enough for me.
And with that, God willing, we can conclude today's session. In what you said first about Surah Tawbah, does Surah Tawbah begin somewhere? Or is this all that it contains? We need to see where it starts, who it is addressing, why it is saying what it's saying. The entire surah explains this. For example, you raised the question that Surah Tawbah mentions a group that opposes jihad, and people use that against us, saying Surah Tawbah is referring to us. If I were to ask you in return, Surah Tawbah says, so kill the polytheists wherever you find them, capture them, besiege them, and sit in wait for them at every place of ambush. Now let me ask you, have you ever seen a polytheist in Pakistan? Have you seen a Hindu walking around in Karachi, in Lahore? You didn't kill him? But Surah Tawbah says, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. Why didn't you? So when people use this kind of reasoning, one feels pity for them. They are unaware of what the full directive is, who it was addressed to, and why it was said. Brother, Surah Tawbah is such that we don't even say Bismillah at the beginning of it. Why? Because it is a surah of punishment. A punishment for whom? For those who oppose the Prophet, peace be upon him. And about that Prophet, peace be upon him, God has explained his practice and his law. It is stated that when this law is implemented, the matter is concluded and punishment is delivered through the hands of the believers. That Prophet, peace be upon him, stood and said, I've been commanded, whoever does not proclaim the declaration of faith, strike his neck. He said, God has provided me sustenance under the shadow of swords. He said, whoever opposes me will be wiped out. If you resemble a nation, you will perish with them. That Surah Tawbah is commanding that Prophet and informing his companions that the time has come. Punishment comes in only 2 ways, either from the sky or through your hands. And at that time, when it is God's command and you are acting upon it, so sometimes when citing the Prophet's words or actions, we should reflect, what are we doing? Are we placing ourselves in the position of Muhammad, the chosen one, peace be upon him, where the command of God is coming, where the Prophet himself cannot stop it, where Gabriel comes and says, go forward? Are we comparing our discretionary decisions to that? And there is a Quran, it explains the rules of jihad and fighting. Jihad is against oppression and injustice. Has anyone ever denied that? Have we? Has Ghamidi Sahib denied that? It's written in his books. But regarding this jihad, what does the Quran itself say? If these scholars had been there during the Prophet's time, at the time of the Truce of Hudaybiyah, they would have been citing these verses and questioning what the Prophet was doing, that is, engaging in a truce with the disbelievers. But what did the Prophet say at that time? He said, these people are trying to ignite the fire of war, but it is not the time. And the Quran said, this is the time to restrain your hands from fighting. Lift things from here, move things from there. You don't try to understand the full framework of religion. You neither understand the overall system of thought in religion, nor do you consider all the instructions of religion regarding jihad and fighting, nor do you formulate any comprehensive course of action. You just pick out a verse, and then people like Ghamidi Sahib, Hassan Ali Sahib, or Wahiduddin Khan Sahib, you start criticizing them, saying they're opponents of jihad. So you're a supporter of jihad in this moment. Support isn't shown through words. If we are the ones addressed by that verse, get up and go fight, if that's what the Quran says. Even if someone holds a wrong opinion, if they act on it with honesty, it's still valid. The companions made an interpretive mistake. They thought it wasn't allowed to go to their wives during the nights of Ramadan, but still did so. So what did the Quran say? You were betraying yourselves. Don't act falsely. Even though it was wrong, we now know it was wrong. Still, the Quran said, it is lawful for you to go to your wives at night, but don't act dishonestly. Act upon what you understand. So if you believe jihad has become obligatory and then you accuse me of opposing jihad, why don't you go and fight? Why don't you participate in jihad? In practice, we want others to do the fighting, and we'll just sit here and send 5 rupees. If jihad is obligatory, then it's not up to you anymore to decide whether to just send money. In whose leadership is this jihad being carried out? Those who have done jihad, when they did it, they tried to prepare the entire nation for it. They consulted with the people. That's exactly what I said, and I got abused for it. That's exactly what I said, brother, that even if you want to go for jihad, the one leading that jihad, there should be a country, a consultation, a religion, a state, a nation. Then you tell everyone, join in because it's written in Surah Tawbah. Back then, some people opposed jihad. So for example, if the Pakistan army says today, we are waging jihad against the Khawarij, and if you oppose it, then I could just pick up a verse from Surah Tawbah and apply it on you. What world are we living in? What kind of things are we even saying? People pick random hadiths from here and there. They don't know their context or background, signs of the end times and battles of the end times. People have built our whole discourse on them. When you get the chance, look into them. Most of these narrations have been fabricated. The Quran paints the picture clearly. It says they will surround you and you will be in a state of decline. Gog and Magog will emerge. So what does the Quran say we should do then? Get ourselves killed, wake up? So reflect on these things, ponder on them, think seriously about them. Instead, we just pick up a religious narrative from here, another from there, another from somewhere else. Take the example of Kaaba. Who fought in Kaaba, brother? The Prophet of God did it. With whose permission? With God's permission. There, God promised victory. He said, you did not throw when you threw. It was Allah who threw. You did not kill them. It was God who killed them. So if burning a tree leads to victory, then why hasn't victory come now? That's the question I ask again and again. The angels haven't descended, have they? So you must answer this. If we are the addressees of Surah Tawbah and those who oppose jihad are being warned, and if doing this leads to victory, then why haven't you achieved victory? These are the questions we ask you.
Thank you very much. We'd like to take your leave now. May God reward you. Thank you for participating in our special program.